Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. So many times, beginners, inexperienced players ask me, how should they prepare? How should they improve their game? What should they study? And I always tell them that when you're just starting out, the most important thing is to understand the value of the different pieces, to focus on tactics, on how to gain advantages of material or checkmate combinations, work on your end game, to know how to close out a game when you're much ahead. And they ask me, what about openings? What about this opening and what about that opening? And I always tell them, openings are not very important at all. In fact, I can tell you that even if I would start a game playing a3 and next move h3, ignoring all opening principles and kind of disregard openings, period, and just play a game of chess, chances are I will win 100 out of 100 times against a beginner player. Because after all, it comes down to the knowledge of strategy and especially tactics. And people are oftentimes surprised that opening is not important because they think that that's where the game starts, so that's what you need to start learning. And that's a big misconception. I strongly disapprove on spending time on opening studies for beginner players. Typically, you shouldn't bother learning almost any opening or very minimal opening until you're at least 1,000, 1,200 rated. And you shouldn't waste much time even up to 1,600, 1,700 level. And then you'll be really surprised that in this lesson, we're yet going to talk about some openings. However, we're going to just deal with some opening traps. And it's also a fun thing to know about different opening traps, more from the reason that you don't fall into one of them. I have to stress, though, that there aren't that many opening traps per se. Most of them are just based on regular tactics that you constantly need to watch out for. But I chose for this lesson 8 little opening traps that are quite important to know, and I'd like you to remember. They are all little short games, mostly less than 10 moves, and I suggest that you may want to memorize them so you'll be really familiar with these ideas. You may want to share it with one of your friends, so therefore you reinforce your knowledge of it. Let me first show you our first example in this lesson, and that is in a Ruy Lopez starting out with these first moves. Bishop b5, and black's most common move here is to attack the bishop. And now white has 2 main moves, either to retreat the bishop to a4 or to trade the bishop for the knight, which is called the exchange variation. The exchange variation used to be a favorite of Bobby Fischer's. He won many nice games with it. Black here typically recaptures with the d-pawn. It's true that black ended up doubling his pawns on the c-file, but it cost white his pair of bishops. And this is an important opening idea that I suggest you remember, that now if the white knight would capture the pawn on e5, that would only be a temporary gain, because the black queen would appear on d4, attacking not only the knight but also the pawn, and then on the next move, after the knight gets protected or moved away, black captures the pawn, checking the white king, and again white is in front of an unpleasant choice, either needing to move the king out of the check, which would mean that white would lose the right to castle, which is certainly not a pleasant thing, especially as long as there are queens on the board, or the other choice is to interpose and force the trade of queens. Of course, in this case, also white loses the right to castle. However, there are no queens on the board, so that has less of an importance. And then on the following move, the rook can get to the open file and kind of castle in directly by then moving the king back to f1. This position would be approximately equal because black's advantage of having both his bishops compensate for the double pawn that black has on the c file. Let's move on to our next example. And in this game, we'll see a very important pattern that actually can arise from a number of different openings. In this case, we're studying the Caro-Kann defense. When you see these two moves on the board, that's called the Caro-Kann defense. White would typically put a second pawn in the center, and so would black. And now white has many decent choices in this position. One would be to trade the pawns or to push the pawn, or of course white can protect the pawn as they did in this game. Knight to c3, and black captures the pawn on e4 and white recaptures. And here the main move for black is either to play bishop to f5, attacking the knight right away, or to develop the knight to d7. Let's see what happens if black chooses a different route and plays g6, developing the dark squared bishop. White would develop bishop g7. White played c3, reinforcing the pawn on d4, even though it was not under immediate attack. Black played bishop g4, creating a pin, bishop c4, and black made a mistake by knight d7. What's important to remember in this position, and not the position itself, but the pattern, what's important, that black has a bishop on g4 that's not protected by any of the other black pieces. What is also important is that black hasn't castled yet, and that white has a bishop on c4, and then of course we already talked about the bishop pinning the knight on f3, so that knight seemingly cannot move because the white queen would be lost on d1. So when you see all these ingredients together in similar positions, always look out if there is an opportunity for a sacrifice as such of bishop takes f7, if the king does not take the bishop by just one pawn, and if the king does take the bishop, then white makes a discovery by knight f3 to g5. Check. The king needs to move, and then white simply captures the bishop. A very important opening trap to remember. Not necessarily the exact moves, but more the pattern, because it can arise from a series of different openings. Let's move on to our next example. And now for a change, we'll deal with a trap in a queen-pawn opening. White played d4 and black played knight f6. Came knight f3 and black played c5. Well, this is a temporary pawn sacrifice, which white, of course, could capture, but it would not mean a long-term gain, because on one hand, the black queen can come to a5, check, and win the pawn back, or black may also play knight a6, which typically is not a good idea, putting a knight on the edge of the board, but in this case, it's temporary, because then on the following move, or within a couple of moves, the black knight would end up capturing the pawn on c5 and getting reactivated. In this position, white's best moves are either to push the pawn forward and gain space advantage, or push the c4 pawn from c2 to c4, or, last but not least, play e3 and protect the pawn. On the other hand, it's an outright error to play bishop f4 in this position. This gives black the opportunity to immediately capture on d4, and then white cannot well take back with a knight, which would be the natural move. It's relatively better to take back with the queen, although then black would gain time by developing the knight to c6. Of course, this is still much better than what happens after the knight captures the pawn on d4. This is a very interesting trick, again something definitely worth remembering. What would you do if you're playing black in this position? Well, the beautiful move is to play e5. But what happens if the bishop captures? Well, then the bishop has been forced into a fork. The bishop is on an unprotected square, and therefore the black queen can check, and then on the following move capture that very bishop. Now, let's go back to this position and talk about queen a5 check for a moment. Could white have switched the order of moves and first give the queen check and then make the fork with the pawn move? Well, he could, but it certainly would not have worked very well for various reasons. For example, white may just block with the queen, and now the black queen is under attack, so black obviously has no time to make the pawn fork with e5, and if black, for example, trades and white takes back with the knight, now the e5 square is not protected by the queen or any other piece, so obviously black cannot just fork like that. Let's move on to our next example. Now we'll deal with a Scotch defense. Again, we are back to a king-pawn opening. White played e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and d4. This is called the Scotch game. Here black typically trades, that's the best move, and knight takes back. Here black has a number of options besides the main line that we'll look at in a minute. Knight f6 is a very decent move, and another interesting move that leads to a very sharp game is an immediate attack, bringing the queen out to h4, attacking the pawn on e4, and when white would protect the pawn, immediately pinning the knight and again attacking that same pawn on e4. Going back to this position, a lot of beginner players are tempted to trade this knight, which is not a great idea, even though it forces the white queen out, which generally speaking is not a good thing to get the queen out too early. However, in this case, because black already traded off his queenside knight, it really cannot be taken advantage of because there is no more knight on b8 that would jump to c6 and gain time in development. So in this particular position, trading the knights on d4 certainly helps white and not black. And here, black plays bishop c5, putting a second attacker on the knight on d4. And here, white played bishop e3. Another common move here is to trade on c6. Now, if black would recapture with either pawn, obviously white has accomplished something by doubling up the opponent's pawns. But here, another tricky idea to remember, black can respond with an intermediate move by playing queen f6. Now, black is threatening to checkmate immediately by queen takes pawn on f2, and at the same time, if white defends against that, black could just capture the knight with the queen if they choose to. This has quite a bit of analysis and theory on a higher level, but to start with, this is more than enough for you to know. So let's go back and see what happens after bishop e3. Now here, black needs to be really careful. Here the correct move for black is to play queen f6 and put yet another attacker on the knight. What's important here is that after knight takes knight, which would be an error, black would have an intermediate move by first trading bishops, threatening now checkmate again, and then when a pawn takes the bishop, then black can capture the knight on c6, or black can even make another intermediate move, capturing the pawn on b2 and attacking the rook in the corner, while the knight on c6 is still hanging. Going back just a little bit, it's also very important to remember that here, instead of queen f6, most other moves don't end well. For example, knight e7 or knight f6, either way, white would immediately win a piece because knight takes knight, now the black queen is under attack, so black has no time to capture the bishop. On the other hand, after black's recapture on c6, white now simply won a bishop. So be very careful with this discovery idea. Another move that's a little better, but still not a great idea, is playing d6, which protects the bishop on c5, but here white gains major strategical advantage after knight takes knight, pawn takes, bishop takes bishop, and poor black has triple pawns along the c file. That's a major disadvantage because that means that the two pawns behind the front runner are paralyzed. They cannot move left, they cannot move right, and they cannot move forward. So therefore, such type of endgame is seriously better for white. Let's move on to our next example. And let's see a Sicilian defense for a change. e4, c5, d4. This is called the Mora Gambit, which typically here continues by playing c3. But instead, white can make a tricky move, play knight f3. In this position, black can just transpose to one of the normal Sicilian lines by either knight c6 or pawn d6 or pawn e6 or pawn g6, any of those choices. Very normal. But how about if black would play e5 here? It's a tricky move, and if you're white, I certainly suggest you do not fall into it. The best choice here for white is to play c3 and go for a Mora Gambit. But why can't the white knight capture the pawn on e5? Well, it cannot because black again would use a pin by playing queen a5. And the white knight on e5 is lost. And now let's go back and see another example, a different one, on the Ruy Lopez. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6. Remember, we were discussing in the very first example about the exchange variation when the bishop trades for the knight, and then capturing the pawn on e5 doesn't result in any gain for white. Let's look at bishop a4. Here the main move for black is knight f6, but there is another one, that's d6. Let's look at the trap that white can fall into here. d4 is already an inaccuracy, because now black can play b5, attack the bishop, and after bishop b3, black would play knight takes pawn, knight takes, pawn takes. And here white has to continue with bishop d5. Instead, capturing the pawn would be a real mistake, because all of a sudden black would gain time by attacking the white queen. If the white queen retreats, black traps the bishop. Or if the queen moves forward to d5, which at first looks like a real tricky move, attacking the rook in the corner as well as trying to checkmate with the queen, black would respond with bishop e6, attacking the queen. Again, if the queen moves anywhere but to c6, black will play c4 and trap the bishop. And if the queen moves to c6, then the black bishop retreats to d7, and then already, after, for example, queen d5, c4 indeed arrives and leads to black's advantage. It's a very important trap to remember that's very typical for the Ruy Lopez. Let's move on to another trap that perhaps we already discussed briefly in one of the other lessons, that arises from the Petrov defense. After these starting moves, which is called the Petrov defense, after white captures the pawn, it's a mistake for black to do the same and capture the pawn on e4. The correct move for black is to first attack the white knight on e5 and only then to capture the pawn. If instead black goes for the pawn, white should respond by queen e2, attacking the knight, and now black is in trouble, because if the knight moves away, white has a discovered check, and then winning the queen. Or if black protects the knight, white attacks the pinned piece. Well, actually it's not quite pinned, but if it moves, it's kind of like a pin, because then the discovery arrives. So the knight really cannot move. The best black can do is counterattack, attack the knight. And when pawn takes knight, queen takes knight, white wins a pawn, because now the black queen cannot capture the white pawn because it indeed is pinned, and that means white simply stays a pawn ahead. And finally, let's see one more example, and that is from the Queen's Gambit. One of the very common starting moves in chess are when white starts with a queen pawn, black does the same, and white plays the Queen's Gambit. This is a temporary pawn sacrifice that black certainly can capture, although keeping the pawn is not happening after, for example, white plays e3. It's only a matter of time when white recaptures that pawn. So the trap I'd like to point out here is after e6, knight c3, knight f6, and the bishop pins the knight with bishop g5. And now black can make this tricky move, knight bd7, which is not a bad move in any rate. White now cannot win a pawn, which it first seems that white can use this pin, because black still can and should capture the knight and give up on their own queen, because here black can check. The poor white king, which is surrounded by all of his own army, has no other choice than to put the queen in front of the king, and that means that black will win the queen, whether capturing it right away or even just capturing the bishop first. The queen cannot run away anywhere, and of course if queen takes bishop, knight just takes back, and it's not difficult to see that black has one more knight than white does, and other than that there is even material. White only has one pawn as compensation for the knight, which gives black a serious material advantage. Well, as you could see from these little opening traps, tactics all around, sometimes as early as the third move. So it's a good idea to be familiar with these opening traps, because sometimes you can catch your opponent on one of them, and of course, just as importantly, you should avoid them. And knowing these patterns can help you recognize a situation, whether it's the same exact position or just something very, very similar. Well, keep practicing and be back next week to gain some more ideas on how to improve your game. Thank you. Until next week.